Let's talk about price ceilings. A price ceiling is a maximum price or a maximum legal price at which the good can be sold. Examples of price ceilings are rent controls and laws against price gouging. Supply and demand analysis predicts that a price ceiling that is less than the equilibrium price has 7 effects. First, the market price is less than the equilibrium price. The price ceiling tends to set the market price when it is less than the equilibrium price. 2. Shortages tend to occur and to persist. Shortages tend to occur when price is less than the equilibrium price. As noted above, the price ceiling tends to be the market price when the ceiling is less than the equilibrium price. In a freely functioning market, the shortage would tend to cause price to increase. However, the price ceiling prevents price from rising. Therefore, the shortage persists. 3. The quantity traded tends to equal the quantity supplied. When the market price equals the price ceiling and is less than the equilibrium price, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. When the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, every buyer willing to buy cannot find a seller willing to sell. Since buyers cannot force sellers to sell more than they want to sell, buyers purchase only the quantity supplied, even though this is less than the amount of quantity demanded. Number 4, the quantity traded tends to be less than the quantity traded in a freely functioning market. The quantity traded equals the quantity supplied at the equilibrium price and whenever price is below the equilibrium price. Therefore, the quantity traded, which equals the quantity supplied, decreases as price decreases from the equilibrium price to the price ceiling. The table below is an example. Row 1 shows what happens when the market is in equilibrium. When the market price equals 10, let's highlight that row. When the market price equals 10, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded equals the quantity traded. They all equal 5. Row 2 shows what happens when a price ceiling makes the market price equal to 8. In this case, the quantity demanded is 7. It is greater than the quantity supplied, and the quantity traded equals the lower of those values, equals 3, or the quantity supplied. Since the quantity supplied decreases as price decreases from 10 to 8, the quantity traded also decreases as price decreases from the equilibrium price to the price ceiling. The 5th effect, alternative rationing devices emerged to ration the quantity traded among buyers. A price ceiling means that price cannot ration the quantity traded among buyers. Since quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, sellers have greater discretion to pick the buyers to whom to sell and to whom not to sell. Not selling to a buyer is not costly because a shortage exists. When the shortage exists, a seller can easily find other buyers sufficient to buy all of the quantity the seller wants to sell. Here are 2 examples of alternative rationing devices. Waiting list and first come, first served allocation mechanisms. Actually, it's three alternatives. Waiting list is one. Showing favoritism to friends, families, and people of influence is a second way to is a second alternative rationing device. And finally, avoiding selling to people with characteristics the seller finds undesirable is a third way to ration without using price. The sixth effect, a gray market emerges in which price is above its legal price. Buyers are willing to pay more than the price when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Sellers can earn more profit by selling illegally to buyers willing to pay the higher price than they can by selling legally to buyers at the price ceiling. And finally, producers will develop and use tactics that increase the real price without affecting the posted price. Here are two ways to raise the real or effective price without affecting the posted price. You can simply reduce the quality of the good. A second way is to require the buyer to purchase additional items from the seller. Now, we've talked about what happens when the ceiling is less than the equilibrium price. What happens if the price ceiling is greater than the equilibrium price? Supply and demand analysis predicts that a price ceiling has no effect on the market if it is greater than the equilibrium price. The market tends to move towards the equilibrium price. A price ceiling greater than the equilibrium price does not prevent price from moving towards its equilibrium and therefore has no effect. An example may help. What would happen if the government passed a law making prices for hot dogs greater than $1,000 illegal? The answer is nothing. The equilibrium price for hot dogs is under $10. Since $10 is legal, the law would have no effect. Here are some examples of price ceilings. The market for apartments and medical care. Let's talk about apartments and rent controls. In particular, let's look at New York City. New York City has a myriad of laws that restrict the ability of landlords from raising rents. The restrictions generally fall into two categories: rent control and rent stabilization. Rent-controlled apartments in New York City are governed by price controls imposed in World War II. They've been around now for 70 years. Rents are very low and are set to cover the cost of building maintenance and improvements. One interesting caveat is that rent-controlled apartments convert to rent-stabilized apartments when they become vacant. Therefore, the vacancy rate is always 0%. Since rents are so low, tenants designate in their will who inherits the apartment to ensure that an heir will enjoy the benefits of the low rents. The optional readings in the preparation section have great stories about rent-controlled apartments in New York City. Also, Doonesbury ran a series of cartoons about the difficulty of finding a rent-controlled apartment. Rent-stabilized apartments are governed by a series of laws passed by the New York City Council. Rents are low, and a government board determines the maximum amount by which landlords may increase rents each year. Rent stabilization often prevents rents from rising to the equilibrium price. Therefore, the quantity demanded is higher and the quantity supplied is lower than they would be at equilibrium. The result is a shortage of apartments. The shortage means that people have a harder time finding low rent, rent-stabilized apartments than high-rent, unregulated apartments. The data on vacancy rates confirms that finding a rent-stabilized apartment is difficult. Here's data from 2008. The vacancy rate for rent-controlled, as I noted above, is 0%. Rent-stabilized, it's 2.19%, and unregulated, it was 4.63%, almost double the vacancy rates of the rent stabilized. So when you keep prices, when laws prevent price from rising, vacancy rates go down. Lower vacancy rates is an indication of shortages of the apartment. Now let's talk about the effect of price controls on healthcare. Rates for the single-payer healthcare system in Canada are set by the national government at prices that are below the rates charged in the private sector in the United States. Similarly, the U.S. government sets rates at VA hospitals in the U.S. that are below the rates charged in the private sector. Supply and demand predicts that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied when the government sets rates for healthcare below the equilibrium price. One signal that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied for a hospital is a long waiting time for patients who want to use the hospital. As predicted, waiting times in Canada and the VA hospitals are long, and I've got links in the notes that give you statistics about waiting times in Canada and the VA hospitals and show you that they are much longer than the wait times for people in the U.S. who are working in a less regulated environment. Now, rent controls, as all price controls do, create winners and losers. Let's talk about the winners and losers of rent-controlled apartments. The big winners are people who live in rent-controlled apartments and pay less than the going rate. However, their gain is diminished when landlords allow the housing stock to deteriorate. Letting the housing stock deteriorate with less service and fewer repairs allows landlords to increase legally the quality adjusted price. The rent control laws in New York City have provisions to punish landlords who let the stock deteriorate too much. Their gains are also diminished when landlords require tenants to pay additional fees or costs that are abnormal. For example, the landlord for a rent-controlled apartment may require security deposits and prepaid rent that are higher than what landlords require for apartments not subject to rent control. Landlords may require tenants to rent the apartment only if the landlord furnishes the apartment and charge more for the furniture than the tenant would pay if he or she rented the furniture directly from a home furnishing store. Studies in New York City show that rent-controlled apartments require tenants to rent furniture more frequently than apartments that are not subject to rent control. The big losers are people who cannot find an apartment because of the reduction in the quantity supplied. Some localities try to stop the decrease in the quantity supplied by restricting the ability of landlords to convert apartments into condominiums. Exactly who wins and loses depends upon the allocation mechanism that replaces price as the rationing device. First come, first served hurts people with busy schedules and helps those with time on their hands or who can afford to employ people to stand in line. Rationing by connections hurts people who are not connected and helps those who are connected. Rationing by how the prospective tenant looks probably hurts people who do not look like the landlord and helps those who are members of groups for which the landlord has an affinity.